Hi, everyone. If you could please take your seats. We are about to get underway. Okay, so thank you guys all for joining us. For those of you that have been here over the past week for this, I guess, back-to-school special of architecture events, I really appreciate you all coming back. And it's an amazing way to close out this first week. We have Jack Self here, who's going to be lecturing on the agony of power, and I guess we'll figure out just how agonizing it is pretty soon. So Jack is going to give a lecture for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And then we're going to open the floor up to discussions. I think we're really hoping that this can be quite an engaged and participatory discussion. But before I hand the mic over, I'll just give a brief introduction for those of you who don't know who Jack is, or even if you do. Jack is an architect based in London. He's the director of the Real Foundation and editor-in-chief of the Real Review. You don't have any copies with you, do you? No. Okay, you should subscribe. His architectural design focuses on alternative models of ownership, contemporary forms of labor, and the formation of socioeconomic power relationships in space. His work has been shown widely, including Maxi, Tate Britain, and his writing has appeared in The Guardian, e-flux, Architecture, New Philosopher, BBC, CNN, and elsewhere. In 2016, Jack curated the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and he's the author of Real Estate's Life Without Debt, published by Bedford Press in 2014, contributing editor to the Architectural Review and editor-at-large for 032C. So with that, I will hand the mic over. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for such a generous introduction and such a comprehensive biography. It's a great privilege to be here this evening, and particularly a great pleasure to see so many friends and family in the audience. So with that, I will begin. I'm not going to really discuss the agony of power. In a sense, what I wanted to do was present a number of ideas, maybe like 9 or 10 ideas, which I've been working on or thinking about recently, and then illustrate them very rapidly with some work, so you can see how these type of abstract thoughts turn into design proposals. But in a sense, the kind of underlying question of the agony of power is, what is the relevance of architecture to contemporary life? And I think, in a way, of course, in order to understand what this is, the first thing is we must understand what is contemporary life, or as I would phrase it, what it means to live today. This is the only slide with multiple words on it, really, or multiple sentences. What it means to live today is basically perpetual crisis as a distraction from long-term wealth redistribution. It's the financialization of every day. It is debt, it is exhaustion, it is self-exploitation. It's a kind of neo-feudalism. It's intense competition, which I'm never more aware than when I'm in New York. And it is scarcity. And I know that sounds kind of bleak, but in a sense, that's just some ideas I have. What is architecture? Well, people say that architecture is, they'll describe it as like the master builder, or maybe the sort of meta art. And this comes from an understanding of techne, architechne. Techne as being kind of art or craft, but actually that's not what it means. Techne means to assemble or to arrange. So you see this in like textile, which is the arranging of threads, or tectonics, which is the juxtaposition or stacking of elements, or even technology, which is, in a kind of literal sense, the instrumentality by which things become assembled. or made. So in that sense, architecture, at least for me, is really just an act of meta arrangement. And in a kind of, let's say, classical sense, this would involve the 5 classical orders of columns and the way in which we might begin to compose a facade based on this assembly. You don't actually redesign the column very frequently. You really just use it as a fixed element that you then arrange into a composition. But of course, increasingly, architecture is not just the arrangement of material or design forms, it's also the arrangement or of immaterial forms, so information systems and flows of that kind. And so in that sense, basically for me, architecture is the meta-assembly of information and of material and immaterial entities. The first kind of architectural idea, I guess, is that domestication is domination. There has been in recent, Peggy's furrowing her brows, there has been in architecture a kind of recent discourse surrounded the oikos. The oikos is the Greek word for household and is the basis for the word ecology and economics. It means household economy, basically, or like household management. And so there's been a lot of discussion around the unit of the home as a kind of part of this economic dialogue. For me, there's a more interesting, or at least less considered, counterpoint to that, which is the Roman idea of the domus. The domus gives us words like domination, domestication. There's a couple of others which we'll come to. But in a sense, we tend to think of domestication as being the process of encouraging animals to work inside a human framework. But of course, the origin of domestication is the domestication of humans themselves. The domina, the person who is the patriarch of the house, has a kind of sovereign autonomy. They have the ability to kill anyone in the house. They cannot be charged for a crime of killing someone in your own house. And they really kind of, they dominate the entire model of the family, whether that's relatives, their wives or children or slaves. In that sense, the origin of the home is by itself necessarily a imposition of an unequal and exploitative power structure. I'm very interested in categories of ownership. I think as part of my bio, Nick mentioned that I'm interested in alternative models of ownership. Well, what does that mean? We are increasingly moving from an economy which is based on production to one which is based on debt. In fact, the last 40 years have pretty much completed that process. An economy of debt is a very different relationship with ownership. If you think of iTunes being almost the origin of this as a popular model outside of rent, basically you rent access to the songs. You don't own the songs. During the medieval era, there were a bunch of monks who were kind of sitting around and they were kind of radical and they were thinking about Jesus saying that you should give away everything you own, you should own nothing. And Jesus is super specific about it. He's like, not a metaphor, give away everything immediately, do not own anything. And these monks were trying to then work out what that could mean for their life, how they could live without owning anything. And so they created 4 categories of ownership. The first was use. So this is a perfect example. You'll hear that I have a slight kind of hay fever, so I have quite a dry throat. The ownership of use, for example, with a glass of water, you consume, in the act of trying to own it, you consume it, you exhaust it. The second category of ownership is usufruct, which means the right of access to a thing. In Britain, if your window gets light for 50 years, you can apply for something called ancient lights, which is a sign you put underneath the window that says ancient lights, and no one can ever build a building that blocks direct access to that light. You don't own the light, but you own the access to the light. It's also quite funny to see kind of old buildings with like ancient lights written all over the outside of them. Public streets are another good example of usufruct. Technically, the land belongs to the state, but it gives us certain kinds of rights in terms of access to that land. The third category is possession. You'll often hear aristocrats particularly say, oh, I don't really own this estate. I'm merely the caretaker for the next generation. And what they're suggesting is, and it's quite disingenuous a lot of the time, but it basically suggests that the ownership is temporal. They own it now, it's not a permanent condition, it'll be passed on to someone else, and they have therefore obligations to a future owner as well. And the fourth is the category of dominion, which really means the right to kill. It means the right to destroy. And dominion is the most extreme form of ownership, means that if I buy an Andy Warhol painting and I buy it and I own it and it's mine and I have dominion over it, I can destroy it. And no one can say anything because I own it. And that basically is, for a number of decades we had a society which was really promoting a form of dominion as the main form of ownership, and is increasingly moving to usufruct or possession, not even really use, except as in quite an exploitative way. Free plan equals free society. I heard a very good definition of feminism today, actually. I was having a conversation, and a woman said to me, that she felt that feminism was basically modernity for everyone who was left behind by modernity. And I said, who is that? And she said, well, of course, modernity is designed around the white male. And of course, as a white male, middle class, well-educated, heteronormative subject, I'm aware of this on a daily basis. But she said, in a sense, feminism for her was the extension of the universal subjectivity or the universal qualities of humanity to basically subjectivities that weren't based on like old white guys. And in that sense, I very much agree with modernism and modernity. The issue that I had really comes down to one of function. Basically, modernism went hand in hand with a project of functionalism. And functionalism began as a way of optimizing arrangements in the factory, and quickly became a way of optimizing activities in the home. So for example, the galley kitchen, which I used to have in my last flat, was a very long, narrow bench, which optimized the activities for a single woman during the day to make a meal for her family. If you got Italians into that space, immediately it became a problematic condition because they cook in a social and collective way. It was impossible to use the space that way. And what that tells you is that when you design a space to fulfill a very specific function, you both crystallize, you support that activity, but you also crystallize that power relation. It no longer becomes possible to change the behavior. And therefore, for me, if we want to create a free society, which is one which is as much as possible egalitarian, inclusive, and tolerant, we must also then not prescribe or make so many impositions on the subject of the home specifically through the constriction of the plan. So in that sense, I would say that a free plan equals a free society. And therefore, as I said, function is irrational. Rationality means basically inhuman calculation. So in architecture, this means basing your work on harmonic proportions that have to do with music or other types of mathematical abstractions which don't relate to the function of humanity. It would be better, rather than to say that form follows function, to therefore say that form follows finance. All buildings, in a sense, are the precipitation of conflict, many types of conflict. Conflict of a commercial, economic, political kind, conflict between the client and the architect, between the fabricator and the architect, between the client and everyone else, between all the parties that are involved. And what you end up with is a kind of precipitate, which is a kind of material artifact that's the result of this conflict. And I think today, bearing in mind what I said about a world which is increasingly financialized in every aspect, of course, I think it's fair to say that when we look at the skyline, of course, New York is the archetypal skyline in this sense. If we look at the skyline of New York, what we see is a projection of capital directly into artifacts with in some cases, a kind of notional relationship to the bedrock conditions. I'm very interested in time as a method of design. And time, space, and money are locked in a kind of trinity. And a lot of the thinking in the West puts space as the primary driver in that trinity. So functionalism is a perfect example of that. When you have a plan which is filled with a bedroom, a kitchen, a living room, a bathroom, it suggests that someone is cooking noodles at the same time that they're taking a shit and having a rest. They're kind of simultaneous activities. And your occupancy of the home is spatially different according to the time of the day or the activity. If you look at, for example, traditional Japanese architecture, which preface time over space in that equation, the rooms would be very empty without a specific function. The furniture was very lightweight and easy to move. And it would be a room that could be a dining room during the evening, a bedroom at night, a sitting room or work room during the day. This is functionalism and multifunctionality through time rather than the other way around. One of the things that interests me about this is that, in a sense, capitalism itself, if what you're trying to do, which is what I'm trying to do, find the seeds of an anti-capitalist form of property exchange from within the structure of capitalism itself, which is, of course, a very dangerous project in some ways, very easy to lose track of what it is you're doing. But there is a kind of event horizon to capitalism in terms of how it thinks about time. So foreign exchange, might be thinking on the term of a day, or day trader. A high-frequency trader is thinking in terms of tens or hundreds of milliseconds. Someone who deals in sovereign debt or, long-term mortgages, for example, might be thinking 50 years. But in a sense, in order to create an alternative today, I think you have to move beyond the event horizon of capitalism. You have to operate at a time which seems too abstract. You have to find a way to colonize a deep future and to embed within it objects that through time will eventually come into the present, but at the moment are only made possible because they are in a lacuna of the capitalist system. And of course, on the subject of time, time in a way has become way more important than money. The only people I know who have any time are very wealthy people, and it's not a coincidence. As I said, our lives today are basically structured around perpetual crisis, perpetually responding to emails, perpetually feeding our social media and performing other minor roles in such a way that we're no longer able to see that or we're distracted or we never get round to, or worse, we treat them as of equal decision-making, the broader restructuring of society and redistribution of wealth which is occurring. And that, that's, it's not ideal. Sharing is caring. We are unlikely to be able to sustain a Western model of life or standard of living into the 21st century for basic ecological reasons. Therefore, if we hope that our children or grandchildren are to have a similar quality of life as us, we need to work out a way of doing a lot more with a lot less. There needs to be an intense reconsideration of an economy of means. And in architecture, I think then, when you begin to think about ownership through time, I think the sharing economy, of which much has been said, offers only really the starting point for an examination of this, because at the moment something like Uber is basically a way of extracting latent value and closing an ecosystem in a chain of purchasing which didn't exist before. So it used to be that you bought a car, that was the end, and capitalism didn't care what you did with the car. Crash the car, drive the car, who cares? Now it's like, actually, as soon as you sell that car, it's only now being entered, re-entered into a kind of closed ecosystem in which it now becomes a productive entity as well. And the difficulty with that is that, of course, it just centralizes the profits from that process, from Airbnb or Uber being excellent examples, into a centralized company. It doesn't actually create any new social conditions except quite dire ones. One can imagine, for example, the rhetoric of Uber, which is your own private driver. This is a form of sequential ownership. When you're in the car, the driver is yours, the car is yours. When you're out of the car, you have no relationship to it whatsoever. These, in a way, if we can imagine that Uber itself, the profit of Uber was distributed in a representational or correct way to both the people who use the service and the people who drive in the service, then you would have basically a kind of self-regulating communist infrastructure, right? Anyway, so that's something to think about. The final thing is the corporate, the final thing is the corporate aesthetic. Sorry about the format of this. I don't know why I should have gone 16:9 instead of 3:2. But the corporate aesthetic relates to the way in which the production of space and the production of material artifacts in architecture has changed. So it used to be, if you look at If you look at the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building, when they were built, architects were in control of about 95% of the aesthetic detailing. They did a lot of the work. They were also responsible for a huge amount. Architects are still responsible for the same amount, but they no longer design the mosaics in the lobby, the lift buttons, the door handles, the window frames, the toilet cubicles. They don't do that anymore. What they do is they outsource, and of course those buildings represent the zeitgeist because they represent a design proposition at the moment in which they're being created, and in some cases a very total vision of the world. That no longer occurs anymore because the architect has had outsourced or has allowed to have outsourced the production of the zeitgeist to material producers. When you are designing a building, you come to the facade, you get the facade book, you flip it open, you see what you can afford from that product list, and you order it by the square foot, and they come and erect your facade. It comes as a proprietary system. That's also true for, you know, the bathroom cubicles and every component, basically. And the architect in Britain, I don't know what it's like in America, only designs about 8% of the building. And that is after it's been obviously value engineered in order to make sure that it's the most optimized form for the site in terms of return and profit, return on investment. In that sense, you know, part of my interest is I would hesitate to identify in any sense as a communist, but if pushed, I might suggest that in the age-old struggle between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks, of course, being those who think that everyone should be working class and proletariat, and the Mensheviks being that everyone should be middle class and bourgeoisie. I mean, my personal disposition is it would be better if we were all bourgeois, which means to make money from the labor of others while not working yourself. I mean, it's quite a kind of thing to imagine what sort of society that would be like if none of us worked. But in a sense, the project of a lot of my design is to try and find financial and other forms of justification in order to design projects in which we can appropriate the language of particularly mid-century modernism and apply it to conditions in which it does not represent the male white subjectivity of traditional modernity, nor does it represent, let's say, corporate lobbies. So this I call the corporate aesthetic. It's a kind of act to repurpose the aesthetic language of that architecture. I'm going to show you some projects very quickly. This is a series derivative architecture that I started after the Occupy movement in 2011. I then went away and did a master's degree in philosophy and macroeconomics. My thesis was on taxation and moral priority, or the morality of neoliberal economic theory, which is way more interesting than it sounds. But in a way, it gave me kind of an insight into the functioning of economics, and it also led me to understand economics. I mean, this is maybe a slight addendum, which was not part of the plan, but is an interesting idea. We think of economics and politics as being able to exist simultaneously in society. Sometimes you hear people say, well, you know, now politics is almost a subset of economics. The only thing we ever hear in politics is economic rhetoric. Well, the history of those two words, as I mentioned, economics comes from oikos, or the household, but it doesn't really mean the house. What it actually means is the household. It means the clan. And in ancient Greece, they didn't have a notion of progress. They didn't have an idea that we were trying to achieve some sort of utopian state for society. Things were as they were. Civilization was timeless. This is how things will always be. But they did have an understanding of how power relations in the city could fluctuate. So sometimes the politicians, sometimes the citizens were in control of the city. And that was called a period of politics after the polis, which is the name for the city-state. And then sometimes there would be a moment of economics, which was a time when private interests and those interests of the clan managed to overwhelm and dominate those of the citizens. And that was when you were basically living under tyranny. I mean, they had basically democracy and tyranny, and these were represented by politics and economics. And the moment at which they flipped, or there was a struggle between the two, they called the civil war, and their word for this was stasis, which is the impossibility of civilization. Civilization is put on pause while economics and politics are in conflict. And I think it's very interesting if we apply that to kind of, let's say, the 20th century. you see very much that the era of politics has gone into a chronic decline and been replaced by 4 or 5 decades of economic rule in which private interest has dominated over those of the citizens. It will be interesting to see at what point that flips back, because if we subscribe to a Greek notion of an impossibility of progress, presumably that will happen at some point, and I would very much like to be involved in that. The derivative architecture series basically stems from the analysis of the subjectivity that I saw most dominant in London at that time, which is the kind of anonymous metropolitan stuck in a job which is meaningless, which they perform half-heartedly, surrounded by objects of intense desire which are totally inaccessible, and this kind of frustration at the impossibility of change in the future. Most of all, central to this is kind of the idea of so much of our income goes on rent. I'm an architect, after all. This subject of housing was of interest to me. What I designed then was a kind of relationship, an algorithm that integrates the conditions of space, time, and money in development in order to create a derivative product. What this means is, it's basically this. In Japan, they used to have 90-year mortgages. Those mortgages were attached to the houses, not attached to the individual. So you never had to go through a credit check. You just bought the house, and if you defaulted, you got kicked out. When you have an 80 or 90-year mortgage, it does 3 things. The first thing is it gives a very high return to the bank because, you know, normally you would pay it off after 25 years. Now you're paying 80 years of interest. For the person who lives there, they get a very low rent because basically if you divide the cost of a house over 80 instead of 25, it becomes really cheap. And the third thing is you have to have a very sustainable form of architecture because any maintenance or repairs that have to happen to the house during that time come out of everyone's profit. So in a sense, it was applying that as a model, long-term financing, to London with the integration additionally of a bond. A bond is basically crowdsourcing the finance. And the idea was that when you move into the building, you would initially pay rent, and then after a certain period of time of living in the house, you would get preferential rights to buy the bond. So eventually, if you imagine that there's 100 apartments in the building, you would own 1% of the building, but you would not own 1 apartment. This creates very different conditions. Firstly, you can move in and out of the building without forfeiting your ownership. Second, if there's a leak in the roof of a building where you own 1 apartment, the guys on the top floor are very concerned and the guys on the ground floor don't give a fuck. This redresses that because all damage to the building is a damage to everyone's collective asset. And you know, it tries to create an incentive for people to take care of their common spaces and indeed to share more utilities and amenities. The product of this is basically this form, which is the kind of outcome, optimized outcome of the algorithm, which when you apply to a building gives you this kind of gold-plated structure. The ambition was to basically create housing of a very high quality at a very low cost in the very center of the city, and that's what this is. It's gold-plated because gold is first of all, gold is an amazing material. It's probably the most ecologically sustainable thing you could put on a building because it doesn't corrode or suffer from pollution. It's a noble metal. But it also tends to increase in value over time. So over a 50-year period that the building is being paid off via its bond, it's gone up by almost 4,000% in value, the facade. That fluctuation, you never intend to take the gold off the facade, but that fluctuation in value, that increase in value, can be used then to draw down finance from the building in order to either pay off more of the bond, in order to return more of the bond to the people who live in the building, or to provide, in this case, there was free crashes, free kindergartens, free cafeterias, and other types of free amenities that were provided within the building. The second project in the series was Default Gray. This basically said, in 3D modeling programs, all material is by default gray, and then you apply a texture to the outside of it. It could be fur or water or fire, it doesn't really matter. But underneath it all, there's an irreducible sameness, which is this gray. And this, for me, seemed like a good metaphor for the way in which identity politics is being considered, which is that we're increasingly concerned with the texture and surface finish of these conditions and less concerned with the structural identity that we're all forced into. I mean, I see, for example, 2 goths, both wearing mysteriously Uniqlo goth clothing, having a dispute on a bus about which type of goth they were and whether or not they were the same type of goth. This basically completely ignores the fact that they are, of course, consumers of a large international brand, but more than that, have a Spotify account, the terms and conditions of their Amazon account, a Facebook account, a bank account, which of course forces you into a certain financial relationship with the state. I mean, all of these kind of conditions which constitute actually a true universal subjectivity were not being discussed, at least in the circles that I was in at the time, and this was very frustrating. Not because the other forms of identity struggles are not valuable, but because I was very interested in what we have in common and how we might begin to discuss those things, and how, therefore, we might begin to intervene in those processes to make some sort of change. And things like the terms and conditions of mortgages have always been a great interest to me in that sense. So this is a building which expresses nothing about its inhabitants on the exterior and leaves them as much room as possible to invent or reinvent their personal lives. Everyone gets a little cell, a kind of micro apartment, which you can join up with your neighbor if you feel romantically or otherwise inclined. But the other half of the floor is this kind of collective room that between 15 people, and that number is fixed. The density of the apartment in effect never changes. That space is to be negotiated by those people in terms of the rules, and that is a kind of using architecture as a means to build community through the necessity of coming to consensus about how we're going to create this, manage this space. The third project was called Empire Hotel. This was an idea that maybe we could use financial arbitrage to create less expensive housing for creatives. Maybe you're familiar with the Chelsea Hotel. Chelsea Hotel, I stayed there actually in my early 20s, and it was quite a kind of interesting experience. But basically my uncle who was staying there had swapped an original manuscript. He's a writer. He swapped an original manuscript in exchange for 2 weeks stay in the hotel. And I was so impressed by this idea of trading creative labor for housing. So the idea of Empire Hotel is that you have a global network, basically like the Hiltons, of these buildings in every city on the planet. And the financial arbitrage comes from the fact that the cost per night in Mexico City might be, say, $70, and the cost in London might be $250. What you get through the whole global network is an average cost of one night on the planet. And what you pay, therefore, is an annual membership, which represents the right to stay in one hotel room for every night of the year. But you cannot stay in any country for more than 3 months, thereby removing you from the processes of democracy and also removing you from the obligation of income tax. You can exchange portions of your membership fee for creative labor, and it's limited to people who are in the creative fields, of which I should specify advertising is not included. This is the interior of one of your studio / hotel rooms. This actually was the product of a workshop I did in the UK to find out what English people think luxury is. So it began basically looking like a prison, and then you slowly add elements to it until they say, yeah, it's like this Donald Judd moment, right? You take out everything, it's really shitty, and you add that one glossy thing, and suddenly it's like very chic. So where is that moment? And it was very telling what the English said. I mean, one thing is they like brass, so there's like the little brass legs. The other thing is they like dark wood, that's luxurious. And the third thing is, and I thought this was the most interesting, the addition of a Turkish rug, which I think in the British imagination represents a kind of exoticism, this kind of oriental exoticism that harks back to their time of the empire, which is deluded. And you have the possibility with your room to kind of combine studios with adjacent friends. You can, of course, book in advance so that you and your friends can combine the space to work collaboratively or simply to be around them. The building itself is only accessible via a kind of deep ramp that cuts underneath the building because it has literally no relationship whatsoever. It is a withdrawal from the state in every sense. It is a withdrawal from the territory. And its occupants are also withdrawing from the nation state as a political body. The fourth project was called Common Stock. In this one, it was more of a kind of typological experiment. It's basically the same model as the ingot, but with an attempt to try and create an idea that if we're prepared to share resources, we might have that sharing can be a form of luxury, not a form of compromise. So how can we share within this building in order to create something that would not otherwise be possible. It began by destroying the idea that you have in high-rise of the core and then the corridor and then all the apartments that come off it. There's a huge amount of functional redundancy in that because everyone has their own tiny living room. If we begin to say, well, would we be prepared to share our living rooms? And can we get rid of something like a corridor? And you'll notice in this that the core is atomized. There is no circulation space. Every room is entered directly from a kind of central lobby. And what you end up with is you save about 18% of the floor plate in the corridor, and through the kind of strategic combining of certain other functions, you end up basically with an entire room on the right-hand side, which is a completely free space. It basically is created by chipping away these kind of useless bits of function. The individual apartments themselves have no functional predisposition. They're basically made up out of two pieces of furniture. One is a kind of transparent wardrobe into which all of your infrastructure and objects go. We can discuss that later. And the other is a kind of daybed, which you can see here. This is what it looked like when this project was installed in the British Pavilion last year. You have this, on the one hand, a kind of vitrine, which is an act of recontextualizing the domestic object in order, one of the reasons I think mops are so badly designed is because no one ever looks at them. They're concealed in a cupboard. As soon as you're forced into a non-hierarchical relationship with all of your domestic objects, as soon as your grandmother's ashes and your bike pump are put on, and last night's Chinese food are all put at the same level, it creates, I think, a different relationship with the domestic realm. And in the case of the daybed, the reason for that was that we found in 2014, the bed overtook the sofa as the most used piece of furniture in the British home for the first time. And what that meant was, firstly, a huge amount of over-occupation. So people are using their beds now to eat meals. They're basically using their bedroom as a mini apartment within the home. There's, people are turning living rooms into bedrooms. There's no longer any common space within the home. People are sharing more and more, but not in kind of ways which are productive. And that meant that the bed becomes this space where you're eating meals, you're doing work, you're socializing either in person or via the internet. And it becomes, in a kind of Marxist sense, a space of production and reproduction. And then, so here you have kind of three arrangements of that daybed. In its singular form, it can be a space for work or a space for rest. As soon as you have two, it creates a certain kind of social relationship between people. And if you have three, then it kind of is reminiscent of the Roman triclinium. The Romans used to eat on their side as a group of three people. They didn't have tables, and so basically the idea, and then if you have 4 or 5 or 6, it becomes, an orgy platform or something. But in a sense, the idea is that there's a gestalt at work, that if you're prepared to bring your bed into a common space, you can create a form of furniture and a form of relations between people that is not possible when you're by yourself. The fifth and final, or maybe this is the sixth project, I can't remember, is the final one in the series so far, called Glass House. And it's a kind of post-functional co-housing model in London that was produced recently for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And you can see, I think in the plan here, that it has effectively a glass louvered exterior and then a secondary skin that's on the inside. And sometimes the distance between those skins is just very narrow, like a kind of veranda, and sometimes it's large enough to be a loggia or an internal space. What you do there is there's no circulation. You can see that there's roughly kind of 4 sets of rooms, I think. That's what an apartment is, actually. Apartment literally just means a set of 3 rooms, a closet, a chamber, and a salon. And for example, in the Palace of Versailles, people would speak about floors in terms of the number of apartments that an individual might have. So you'd have 2 sets of 3 rooms. So in this case, you basically have kind of 3 rooms in a sense. You have a kind of glass sculpture, which becomes the bathroom. And then you have 2 spaces, one large, one small. There is no circulation. You come directly out of the lift, which is in the bottom left corner, into a kind of loggia, indeterminate space. And then apart from that, the kitchen is shared, but then you just have these 3 other qualities of space, these 3 other rooms which point in different cardinal directions. They have no presupposed function. They're very kind of free. And of course, the 2 spaces which are the hardest to kind of void of this functional predisposition are the kitchen and the bathroom. And in the case of the bathroom, this is turned instead into a kind of glass sculpture, which tries as much as possible to destroy its sanitary or functional or kind of connotations and history. These are images of the model as it was installed in Chicago. Of course, you have to go through a kind of process of abstraction in order to make it kind of work, and that's it. This, I think, is the final project I'm going to show you, which is, this year, Real Foundation has had a whole bunch of canceled projects, which has led me to the conclusion that working in cultural institutions can be not always very rewarding. In this case, this was a commission by the Tate Modern, who asked Real, basically they said, we're on the 5th floor of the new extension, we have a problem. On the 6th floor is the observation deck that everyone goes to. On the 4th floor is a permanent collection, which everyone goes to, but they skip the 5th floor. They never go there. It's always empty. We want you to create something which incentivizes people to come to this floor. And I said, do you have any kind of thematics in mind? And they said, well, we're kind of interested in like universal basic income. And I said, uh-huh. And they said, and how time and labor are changing. I said, yes. So they knew very specifically the kind of thing they wanted, but they didn't know what they wanted at all. And so what we proposed was basically, at the moment when you go to a Tate Modern exhibition, you pay to go to the exhibition. In this exhibition, we pay you to go to the exhibition. You go to the exhibition, and every person who goes gets an artwork worth £100. But in order to get your artwork or claim it, you have to take a ticket and wait, which is a very kind of English activity. And it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to wait for your ticket number to be called, and then you get your poster and you can leave. So two things. One is we're going to create £1 million of art to give away over 8 days. And the second thing was basically you're now in this space, you're waiting, you don't know what you're supposed to do. There's nothing you can do, really. You just have to wait. And that is the essence of being bourgeois. And this is an opportunity for everyone to experience what it's like to be bourgeois, where you will profit from the labor of an artist while doing nothing. And so the space was basically imagined as this huge red carpeted room with a series of volumes, some of which all wrapped in carpet as well. So there's no kind of like, discourse of the plinth. They're just boxes. And they create relationships between people of different kinds, at different heights and of different kind of conditions. Sometimes they block your vision completely. And then into the middle of them, there are also these kind of rugs onto which you would put reading material that would be relevant. And you put these kind of Arne Jacobsen mid-century lights over the top of this, because I've noticed that if you shine a light on a carpet, people immediately assume that they're supposed to be looking at something. And so if you put a book under there and then a light, people will naturally sit down to read the book. It's like that's how kind of architectural space I've discovered has worked. But in a sense, what you're also doing is appropriating what I would call like a proto-bourgeois aesthetic. It's almost bourgeois. It's almost like an abstracted version of it, in order to give everyone this opportunity. And what happened was the Tate initially really liked it. And then they spoke to acquisitions, and acquisitions said, we have a very strict policy on this, which is you cannot just create new pieces of art which we have no control, and then they're in our archive. This needs to go through a proper acquisitions policy. So that was a problem. And then the other one was that the kind of higher up elements said, well, are you creating £1 million worth of art, or are you creating £1 million worth of art? And I said, well, it's a very interesting institutional question. If I say it's worth £100 for this artwork, put it on eBay, see what happens. But if you say it's worth £100, you're pretty much the central bank of art. So it may actually be worth £100. And they said that this was not the type of institutional critique that they found very polite. And when I offered to change to a new proposal, they said that they didn't really want to work on this project anymore, and that they looked forward to working with us in the future. So I'm waiting for the call. These were some other kind of, in a sense, the kind of final thing I wanted to show you was the Real Foundation itself as a project. Because if we understand architecture as the arrangement of systems of information flows, of many other things, it means that the social figure of the architect and the structure of the architectural firm are both subjects for design as well, not just buildings and whatever. So the Real Foundation is designed, it's actually a limited company, but it has a kind of board of advisors who vet all of its projects. It has a mission statement, which makes it only perform certain types of socially minded activities. And we do, it's a cultural institute and an architectural firm. So we do exhibitions, we do a lot of publications. We publish a magazine called The Real Review, which is a kind of contemporary culture magazine, which is a partnership with OKRM, who are a graphic design and design studio. And that's, that, in a sense, is a kind of summary of what it means to live today as seen from the perspective of me, Jack Self. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack. That was, yeah, a very, I don't know, almost suspiciously smooth and convincing presentation. But I'll maybe kick this the discussion off with one question, and I've seen this kind of derivative architecture project evolve over the past few years, and I never really. I was never really able to connect it in the same way to a history of radical architecture that I have when seeing this. And there was this one image, I think it was from Default Gray, where you're looking, through the window, and you see. I think what's most radical in this is that you, no, one back, this one, no. So I think what's most radical here is actually not at all this. It's everything that you see out the window. Because I think you're proposing, or you seem to be, sure. But when you see the, let's say the old system from above, it made me think of the situationist rhetoric of the beach beneath the streets. It really made me think of what is. What is the purpose of everything else? And so, continuing with this idea of a new way of life, and so in this image I see like New Babylon starting to spread, not necessarily horizontally anymore, but vertically. But Constant really grounded his belief or his architecture in anthropological essentialism of Homo ludens, and you seem to be doing this with the figure of the bourgeoisie, which Homo ludens plays, but the bourgeoisie waits. So I'm wondering if there's in this sort of space, would we just be waiting?
So in a sense, this image is the counterpoint to the one that you selected. There are 4 types of terrace house in London and in Britain generally. Each one corresponds to a very specific class structure. So who you are in the city depends on what type of house you live in. And this was basically the law for almost 400 years. In Europe, you got a horizontal stratification. In Britain, it was illegal to have multiple occupancy until the 19th century, and it was one family per house. And so you get this, right? And then the difficulty with Default Gray, as with the Ingot and a lot of the projects within the derivative architecture series, is they're effectively architecture of protest. They fail to move into the, if I can just be my own critic for a minute, they fail to move into the realm of systemic proposition in a way that something like New Babylon does. So in a sense, like, this is a sort of pressure point. It releases the pressure at a certain moment, but if you look at it even formally, it's in total opposition to everything in quite an angry way. The trick, I think, as this series goes on, and certainly I'm trying to get, look at this one, for example. I mean, Trafalgar Square is the center of the British Empire, and I put a 170-meter wall of Carrara marble, which is a blind facade. That tells you exactly what I think of the state and the empire. But it also, and then the other side is like a mirror facade, which also basically disappears. But in a sense, what I'm trying to move towards with projects like this is trying to occupy the the ground of normalcy, or trying to normalize this as a project. And that's how you end up also with those types of aesthetics that you mentioned, which are, you know, they're not so much intended in the way that you meant them. They're more intended as an idea that if this is a space that as an individual you can, for £240 a month, which is like $300, you can live in almost the center of the city in a room like this, in a kind of miniature apartment, and you have access to this as a space. You know, this, suddenly the fact that it's filled with a Saarinen and an Eames and a Mies daybed, this becomes suddenly quite a different proposition for the subjects who would be occupying this. And that's kind of what I was trying to achieve, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear, you know, your self-criticism that this is not a systemic proposition, because I think a lot of the way that this can be read, and you know, one of your first slides where you show the algorithm is quite, it at least, you know, pretends to say, like, you know, this is actually just something that can be deployed throughout the entire city.
It can, but not formally, because the form follows the finance, but finance alone is not enough to dictate the form. And that's why we must have another kind of formal, and I would argue typological project, which is able to respond. And so the typological project, which for me goes along with long-term finance, is necessarily one that relies on very high levels of sustainability, whatever you might understand that, but in my understanding basically means a building that's able to adapt over time and have very low maintenance over time, and of course post-functionalism, which is also part of a freedom agenda, you know, the free plan equaling the free society, but also as a response to the fact that if you have a financial model which lasts 100 years, I mean, there was no way that in 1917 they could have imagined what 2017 was like. It's it's just impossible. But we can know certain things about the future. We can know, for example, that future services and technologies will either be hierarchical and networked, it'll be basically pipes or tubes, or they'll be wireless, in which case that's fine. Therefore, you know, you begin to do things like leave redundancy within structural cores for new technologies or new ways of, you know, being that we can't imagine yet. And you do that at a technological level as much as you do it in a kind of a typological way as well.
Okay, because I mean, it's, you know, there are, you know, in these alternative ownership, you know, models that you're putting forth, maybe not to the, you know, to the temporal dimension that you're speaking about them with, you know, there are these subscription models that are becoming, you know, I think London is maybe one of the biggest places for this, and that itself, I mean, I imagine, you know, it's based on kind of a versioning model, no? So so I don't know, I wonder, I don't know, I'm just kind of like, I guess my end question is, you know, how do the bankers actually see this? Do they really see it as like that radical, or is there, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
In 2012, it was, and I knew then, it was very frustrating. In 2012, when I started working on it, I knew that this was about to become the future of housing in London, because there was no alternative model that could have been adopted. We had maxed out in every other direction. And this was an attempt to kind of inject into that space over which, you know, I have no capital, I have no access to capital, I have no credibility that's required in order to achieve those things. Therefore, there's a kind of lack of agency or power, and all you can really do is inject into that a kind of intellectual proposition, basically. That's frustrating, but I am working on trying to get capital. And in a sense then, you know, so at the time this was seen, we worked with the PricewaterhouseCoopers and also the Halifax group to develop the ingot, and it was seen at the time as being a realistic and attractive, if unorthodox, model. The difficulty or difference is that, firstly, the amount of time, that it has to be a financial model which is long enough to move it beyond the horizon of capitalism. Otherwise, you're just accelerating a rentier economy, and you just increase the exploitation of the individual. The point of setting it so long is precisely, you know, the idea that, first of all, it cannot ever be bought or sold within a century. So you, in effect, create something which has zero market value. I mean, this was actually what concerned PricewaterhouseCoopers in the end. They were like, but what do you do with the capital appreciation of the project? I said, you don't do anything with it. And they said, but the building's going to go up in value. every year it's going to go up in value. And you've got a loan which is fixed, which is not even the market value, which is attached to the construction value. So if you imagine that, the developer takes a 20% profit, I'm taking a loan on how much it costs to build. I'm not taking a loan on how much it would cost to buy in an open market. So there's already a 20% reduction. Well, where does that money go? And then it's like goes up every year. Where does that money go? And I said, you don't use that. You don't use that money. And they were like, but that's throwing away money. What are you, crazy? I was like, I'm anti-capitalist, and that's the space I've created for it. And I said, what do you care? You get your 5.5%. And they said, fine. So in a way, what we're seeing is kind of shorter-term models which in the end basically just act as another form of rentier economy. They don't offer a real alternative. The other thing is that model was designed so that if you imagine the kind of loan, as the money that you borrowed is paid down by the rent, you build up ownership as a company, and that ownership is then given back to the people who live in it by selling them, by giving them the bonds which are attached to their rent. So in a sense, you're effectively creating a cooperative. You're taking money from places like Russia and China, which would normally just, they say I want 200 million pounds worth of architecture, of housing in London, and they just go out and buy actual apartments and leave them empty. And that's a real problem. In this case, you're diverting that money not into actual property, but you're saying, okay, buy 200 million pounds worth of bonds in this building, and then you can sell them whenever you like. You don't have to worry about real estate agents selling your flat. It's a liquid asset which can be traded in a secondary market if you want. So that also is a kind of radical distinction between the models which have arisen and this one, which is it's a kind of Robin Hood activity. You're taking money from the international markets, channeling it through an attractive architectural proposition in order to create low rent for the people who live there, and eventually for them to build up ownership as a cooperative. And that's really it. While at the same time creating a form of property that cannot be exchanged, has no market value, and throws away profit. So that's kind of, and then onto that basic model, you basically say, is there a way for the individual and the family to be free within this housing condition? And that's 2011 through 17. And of course, with the kind of farcical ambition of one who still believes in the possibility of human agency, I have a 10-year plan, of which I'm at 7 years. The ambition is that by the end of the 10th year, to have constructed one viable example of what this might look like. And that's what we're really working on at Real at the moment with 2 separate developers to try and realize one of these projects. And it has many barriers and boundaries, and I can see why PricewaterhouseCoopers in the end were not interested in helping us with it, because it is a complex project. But if it can be achieved, and I hope it can be, then of course I may have 3 or 4 more other 10-year plans, and then death. And that will be my contribution to what I consider to be the expansion and continuation of modernity, which in its basis is founded on the scientific method, which says you cannot believe anything unless you can prove it, and anything you prove can be overturned at any minute. That is why I also believe, just to kind of make it a bit more topical, that fake news is like either the end of Western civilization or a flash in the pan, because you cannot build a scientific society on fake news. Therefore, either you must return to truth as the foundation for your society, or you must abandon the society. And they're the options.
With that, I mean, this could continue, but I think it's better to open it up.
Yes, sorry. It's kind of mini lecture in a lecture.
No, it's great. Thank you. Thanks. Questions from the audience?
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Jack. Always very thought-provoking. I have a ton of questions, but I wanted to just ask like the simplest one first, about the sort of the corporate aesthetic statement. Because of course, like the kind of mid-century modern Mies was a corporate aesthetic, but now if I think of corporate aesthetic, it would be KPF towers. And I think that's something that like it's okay to just say you love Mies. I mean, Niall.
I like Mies very much, much more than I like Corbusier, in the kind of rivalry between them, the two of them. I much prefer Mies, who is an avowed agnostic, who is able to quote "City of God" by Saint Augustine off the cuff, and someone who, incidentally, is both interested in how to express his time in a very kind of logical way, not in a revolutionary way, actually, but very much in a kind of rational way, and of course is also interested in the free plan. But as opposed to Corbusier, who's basically like an avowed atheist who's into kind of bull mysticism and, messing up Eileen Gray's house, and, he comes from a history of a country that produces concrete, which tends him, pushes him towards kind of plastic forms, which I find unjustifiable. I like Mies's history in the Ruhr Valley, which is steel and glass and things which are very orthogonal. But these types of personal preferences, in a way, I would never hero worship Mies, because then you can't learn anything from his mistakes. I saw the Farnsworth for the first time last weekend, and there are some very, very beautiful moments in that building and some details that I could not have imagined without having seen it. But there are also some really glaring faults with that building, not just technical faults, but ideological faults, which if we worship him, we cannot surpass. So yeah, I like Mies, but he's not the be-all and end-all. What I would say, though, to actually answer your question, is to say the corporate aesthetic is more of a kind of, at least for me, a kind of phrase that refers to a methodology of production. So it has to do with the fact that the production of new forms and of new design doesn't occur within the studio of the artist, but occurs within the factory where they manufacture the things. And therefore, it's a corporate structure which dictates whether a frame of a window is of a certain dimension or not, or in a certain style and so on. It's less to do literally with the kind of corporate lobby, which is definitely, it's a confusing term. I need to come up with a better one, basically, but it sounds cool, and that's what I mean. An aesthetic which is driven by corporate structures rather than one which is driven by artistic or other forms of creation.
Thank you, Jack. I've been following your work for a while. I've never seen you talk, and it was really nice, so thank you. It was a nice lecture. My question comes to, I guess I would say, representation or imagery, or maybe even drawing. Because I think as you speak of many truths, but could be viewed as radical or different, or a critique of architecture, mainstream architecture, if you'd like, or market neoliberal architecture. At the same time, and I don't necessarily mean that as a critique, but I see that the way in which you present your architecture is through very beautiful, well-crafted imagery and drawings, of course. But I could probably identify with, let's say, the style of maybe a mainstream architecture or an architecture that is produced by tools of capitalism, AutoCAD, Photoshop, these sorts of things. And I wonder if you feel troubled by that the tools you're using are also the tools of incredibly powerful companies. And these sorts of things, and whether or not, the reason I ask is because I think in at least American discourse of architecture, there is an idea or a statement or maybe a myth that in times of buildings, departing from what the architect sees in an ethical kind of proposition of physical form, the architect can depart from the physical world and enter the realm of drawing, which is the kind of realm in which the architect has full control over that world in which he or she creates. And that world of representation then opens up a realm of creativity that can then vision the world anew within the ethical realms in which the architect finds acceptable. And so I'd like to add, and so the question is more, who are the images for? Are they for us? Are they for architecture? Are they for clients? And is there an embedded critique of imagery or the status of imagery in contemporary architecture within your project?
That's a really excellent question. I really appreciate it very much. The first thing is to say that I'm very influenced by a group of Marxists from the 1960s called the Autonomia movement. They basically believe, their slogan was against from within, and they believed that the only way to create radical change was not by revolution, but by progressive reform from within, by occupying the structures that you wish to transform. There's also a problematic of the kind of pragmatic of the fact that I do not have enough imagination to work out how to use tools of architecture which are non-capitalist by their nature. I mean, I also am a product of a university system where I was given certain abilities and so on. I can't think of how to escape that. But the third thing is, in a sense, what's the purpose of the image? And I think that, was part of the question, and representation, which is very, very interesting for me. What is the image for? Who is it for? And how have you created it to achieve that? The main thing I would say for me is that the image in architecture is about seduction, actually. I'm not really interested in intellectual... the point of this project is, in a way, to create real buildings. It really is to... Because the thing about buildings is, you can debate what the building means, but a building is a kind of fiat. It's like an act that is done. It exists. It's a material artifact that is there. And if you've designed it in a particular way, it will continue to function with human occupation in more or less predictable ways for a very long period of time, even if the architect has no longer any involvement in the building. It doesn't require mediation. It's kind of real thing. So then, in my case, I'm trying to build real buildings. And the question is, how are you going to achieve that? And how is imagery going to play into that? Of course, I began my degree in architecture before the 2008 crash, at a time when imagery was being used. Imagery was no longer even being used to leverage the beautiful cultural project. It was now just being used as a tool of speculation. You didn't have to do an image of the Bilbao Guggenheim and then build the Guggenheim. You just had to do an image of it, and that was enough to raise the land value and the anticipation of the project. And architecture at that point the image became such a powerful tool of seduction. Sorry for the wandering here. I've literally never thought of this before. It became such a powerful engine of speculation and seduction, as I don't think it has existed before. That, for me, is basically then to say, how can we use this idea of the seductive image as a way to convince people to build it's the Trojan horse, right? You're like, that is a nice horse. It looks exactly like I thought a horse should. It's very nice of them to send this sculpture. Bring it in. And, that's it, right? So then, but there is another aspect to image making which for me is very important, which has to do with what I think the difference between representation in the image and reality is. This image is a very good example of that. If I can just kind of analyze it for a second. The first thing is that it's divided into thirds. It is a 16:9 proportion. I always do landscape 16:9, even when that means that you have an arbitrary cutoff of something that you wanted to show. You just have to now do 2 images. The reason for that is that 16:9 is the universal format for sharing images. It's designed around the screen, which is to suggest that you're not looking at paper, you're really looking at a digital image which is designed as a JPEG or PNG or TIFF. And it has also a very fixed DPI that I always work in. That's why earlier I was like, oh, I should have done 16:9 instead of 3:4, because I'm very aware of these screen proportions. It concerns me that the new iPhone has a completely different ratio, because that's like not right. Anyway, but what you have then within this is, first of all, if we imagine the perspective that is from this, it is an impossible perspective. It's actually a kind of universal non-perspective. There's no subject who would ever be parallel to the exterior of the facade in this way. So it's an impossible view. So then it tells you immediately that what you're seeing is, in effect, metaphorical in a way. It's not a real view. But then if we imagine and we look at it for a second, well, it follows all the rules of classical composition. If you look at the placement of the painting on the wall, you look at the way in which the grid has been framed, and all of the items within that space draw the eye from one thing to another in a narrative of the life of the interior of that space. What that is trying to achieve is to say the space is both literal and metaphorical simultaneously. So, the example I sometimes give on this is the head of the dining room table is both metaphorically the head of the table, and literally the head of the table. If you create a circular table, you destroy the head of the table, both literally and metaphorically, as Arthur and his knights knew. So in this image, you are both looking at the metaphorical representation in a narrative and classical sense of an impossible Renaissance view, but it is also hyper-real, and therefore you are actually looking at the composition of daily life. And that's basically how I compose images. And as I said, I mean, all images I produce, I have one exterior, which is a combination of collage and render, and I have one interior, which is always basically render. And I found some settings in V-Ray that I really liked in terms of capturing English light, which is a very diffuse light, in the mid-2000s, and I've never updated V-Ray since because I'm afraid that in the new one, some of the values that I want no longer come out this way. So I have to use a very old computer in order to achieve this, which maybe is a kind of anti-capitalist statement. I refuse to upgrade. But frankly, all my software is hacked anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. All my software is cracked. I use no legal software. Well, I was working with a studio whose name I'm not at liberty to say, and they said they were working for a large commercial client, and they were like, we included on the list of things that we wanted like licenses for the Adobe suite. And they were like, yeah, all right. And now this is the first time ever in our studio. We've got 16 people working for us. It's all legit now. We're so grown up. And I was like, you opened your studio in 2004. This is like 13 years you've been using cracked software. How did no one find this out? And they were like, everyone's just so cool about it. They accept the fact that if you want to work as an architect, you cannot possibly afford the software. Anyway, slight detour, and also hopefully, I mean, it's not too much of a detour to say that, you know, in terms of the composition of even this image, it follows exactly the same, you know, the rule of thirds, the narrative line of the eye. It's always the case for every interior, irrespective, often a single point, often an impossible point that's being presented. But that's my kind of commentary on, let's say, contemporary representation. I might have more ideas, but I'm not really technically sufficiently adept to create an avant-garde in drawing in a way that I might like. So I settle for this. Oh. Oh, hold on. I think the guy with the microphone, and then we'll come down to you.
So, hi. Who are the buildings for? Because if one of the things that you talk about how these spaces lend themselves to society and challenge the redistribution of wealth, and you talk about class, but how are these buildings and these spaces negotiating like race? Because class and of course class and race are very separate. So in terms of how these spaces are going to negotiate themselves, how are you going to police, police or filter who gets to exist in these spaces, and how many spaces are going to be built over throughout these cities? Because while the model works, it doesn't really lend itself to prejudice, and there are so many words that kind of what are the affects of certain spaces like this, and what is the sustainability? Because a lot of the times we see spaces that are very phallic spaces that are built to accomplish so much, and then we see the a change in not a change in form, but a change in practice. So
Totally.
the building exists and it's beautiful or whatever, but it in a large part it can be like an artist's studio.
Totally. And I mean, I think there's very good examples of that in London, where you have, for example, something like a building like Trellick Tower, which was originally built as social housing for disadvantaged families, many of whom had been displaced by Second World War and were basically without homes. And now it's occupied the property prices have gone up so much that those modernist flats are now occupied almost exclusively by very wealthy people with nice art collections and so on. So, the process of gentrification, if I've understood your question correctly, it's a question of how do you, in a way, lock in these ideas of diversity, inclusivity, to the practice or the occupation of the architecture itself, to avoid it being effectively co-opted by, other less desirable forms. Is that?
Yeah, because I mean, like whiteness is almost synonymous with property. So I mean, like, because
Yeah.
like you're actively demystifying that by changing the actual model.
Yeah.
It still doesn't exist independent of capitalism. So if these buildings exist in that society, it doesn't really like lend itself
Yeah.
to this new market. 'Cause
Yeah.
we would have to like the way that I kind of imagine this being effective is that we like blow up the entire every fucking city and we build these buildings and we're like, okay, this is exactly how it's going to be. I feel like we there needs to be like a dictatorship.
Yeah,
for this
there
stuff
is
to actually be
and
effective.
basically, as a two-part response. The first is I mentioned a couple of times tonight the history of monasticism, and monasticism. I mean, I'm an atheist Jew, but monasticism is a very important ideological framework for me because monasteries were, first of all, communities of people, but they were always based on a rule. And the rule was like a list of like do's and don'ts. And the thing about a monk is, if you're a priest and you're ordained into the religion, you can be a bad priest. You can break the rules, right? You cannot break the rules of being a monk because a monk is not about particular dedication. The rule is lived out and it's enacted. It's a form of life or even like an art, life as an art form. So if you stop doing those practices, you stop being the monk. But what I like very much about this monastic condition is that the individual is totally free and completely non-judged when they are alone within their individual cell. They have total liberty to, because everything is considered an act of God. So you can, sing or do private prayer or write a history or do a mosaic or make a sculpture or wood carving. It doesn't matter. Or plow a field. It's all an act of God. Whatever you choose to do is up to you. And then you come together at specific moments, particularly prayer and meals, in order to reinforce the collective ideology of the group. And that is, in a way, my understanding of community, which is community must be premised on the idea of being able to be alone. The ability to withdraw from the community if you so choose, because then the community becomes a very active and living thing in which everyone is invested in it. So the different buildings, actually, they're not kind of totally hypothetical cases. They all deal with very specific subjects. So the very first one was actually a response to something I had read, the gold one that's next to Tower Bridge, London Bridge. There was a problem in that part of the city where it was no longer possible for school teachers, what we call key services. So school teachers, firemen, fire people, fire services, ambulance and paramedic services, school teachers, things of this kind. They could no longer live close to where they worked. And because of the cost of a train ticket going up all the time, they could actually no longer even afford to commute to those areas. So there were schools being shut down, emergency services were being shut down. So the idea was, how do you get 3,000 key workers into that location? And that building is a product of that. So it's imagined very much as people who are actually probably only living there on a temporary basis for 3 to 5 years, and who have very minimal, requirements in terms of and that's why the interior of the building is very kind of generic in a sense, because it doesn't really have much to say about that. It's more about them being in a geographic location. But for Default Grey, the really tall one, that was a response to Croydon Council, and it was in conversation with them. They have a problem, which is they have a very high percentage of predominantly Middle Eastern migrants, and those family structures are very large. So by white Western traditional standards, right? They're not atomic families with 2.3 kids. They have a very different notion. So the idea, and there's a total shortage of 3-bedroom apartments. They don't exist at all. So that model where you have 15 individuals who collectively manage and organize a space was an attempt to say, how can we provide something which is not a 1, 2, or 3 bed, but actually something which could be an 8 bed or a 4 bed, or maybe you take all 15 and that's a single family home. In a sense, the structure, but to kind of come back directly to your question, the structure and rules of how people enter into that building are integrated into the origin of the building. So it would not be possible to dissolve the cooperative because it is a cooperative that's established as a legal entity. So only the people who live in the building would be able to dissolve their own cooperative. So it would only be basically if everyone in the building decided to cash out simultaneously. And the likelihood of people reaching an agreement on that would be quite low. So you bake those systems into the rules of operation of the building. And in the case of Default Grey, every single unit of 15 people actually it sends a representative, 2 representatives per floor, and collectively they then have a democratic structure for enacting certain processes and management of the building, as a cooperative should. So then, of course, you have these whole systems of how people are represented, how their interests are represented, how they manage their space is up to them, because how you decide on the rules of that space has to be a kind of constant and ongoing discussion between the people who live there. And you would hope to provide the kind of educational services that are required in order, those are baked into when you arrive in the building. That's how it works. And that, in a way, is also how society works, which is, I would argue, I would argue particularly in the case of class and race, that these are totally learned constructions, and therefore if we could imagine a society in which they were never learnt in the first place, you would end up in what I would consider to be a far superior situation. And so this architecture is therefore trying to create alternative rules in order to create those types of conditions. And that also, it sounds contradictory, because it sounds like, well, why do you need so many rules to create a free society? Well, that's why I come back to the monastic example of freedom is only possible within the ideological collective, within the community, basically. So that's, I guess, what I'm thinking. And, these other ones are also, one was then also trying to attempt to deal with creative labor, which was a product of the fact that I found it harder and harder to pay for my own rent as a creative, increasingly on freelance contracts, very, very difficult to survive in London. I was like, man, it'd be awesome if I could just do like a weekend of free architecture work and then, live here for a week. I mean, can we imagine a model like that? And so that's how that comes about. But in a sense, at least for me, the system of management, I mean, comes right back to what I was saying about architecture as being a meta-assembly. It's not just about the physical form, it's also about the systems of information exchange and regulation and management of the household. That's how you create those societies. You cannot have one separate from the other. They need to be so integrated. The financial model, the social model, and the architectural form, so integrated they cannot be separated, and therefore you cannot accidentally end up in a situation in which the home or the building becomes appropriated or by the capitalist structure that you're trying to resist. And that, proof is in the pudding. We'll see, I guess, what happens as I continue to try to build. I'm sure there will be many problems that I can't even imagine now with this as a model, but that's the aspiration. Oh, sorry. We'll maybe come to you next.
Thanks a lot. So it seems like what you're starting to just describe might be closer to like nation building than architecture or something, which may be a useful form of urban development. Do you think that's a problem?
It's institution building as I see it. I would be hesitant to use the word nation because it implies cultural homogeneity. I mean, a nation is not, of course, a nation state. A nation is a homogeneous culture that shares recognizable qualities like language and traditions and so on. And also nations are normally defined by what they aren't. So, the Italians are not the Swiss. That's how it's both, the formation of a nation is basically a cultural group or a large body of people who decide that collectively certain qualities that they share represent them as an entity, and there's a kind of political that they're aware of themselves as a political body. Now, while certain qualities of that, particularly the idea that the nation is aware of itself as a political entity, are true. That is part of what it is I'm trying to produce. I don't think that cultural homogeneity or uniformity or even shared language is an important value. So I prefer to use the term institution building, which basically is to say creating juridical, legal, financial, and architectural structures which can create this. But basically, it's also a response to the fact that I really am profoundly disappointed by the nation that I live in. And I'm sure many of you may feel similarly about your own nations, which is, ideally it would be the early 70s and I would be an anonymous architect working for the state to produce the best social housing I could. I probably never would have heard of feminism or the female orgasm or, any of that type of stuff that we have to think about now. But on the other hand, it would be an uncomplicated life in which I could really morally support the state and its activities to try and modernize and improve the conditions of the people. There's a kind of political representation there, which I agree with. Now, I see absolutely no interest whatsoever from the state to support the lives of its citizens in any meaningful or material way. It does not build housing directly, and the housing that it builds indirectly, it actually only accelerates the housing speculation that we have in the UK. So when you reject the state, what do? Well, you can try and find an island where you can create some sort of false paradise for yourself in which you don't have to think about other people, or you can engage with the struggle of society and the knowledge that you cannot possibly win and probably can't make that much change, but nonetheless you get the moral righteousness of having dedicated your energy and your limited resources towards a cause that you believe in.
I want to start this by saying I appreciate your anti-capitalist stance, and I think I support that. But if I can play the devil's advocate for a moment and go down the road, if you get these projects built, of where it may lead with your institutional building and design, I'm wondering if you are familiar with the works of Solzhenitsyn, like Gulag Archipelago.
No.
Highly recommend you read it. Basically, it's about the Gulag system in Soviet Russia and how the good intentions of socialism there had turned into this very harsh political organ system that forced people to live in these cells in the gulags and to work for the state. And I guess it's a criticism, but I don't know, because I appreciate where you're trying to go. But you have these similar buildings all over the world, and they're all gray, and there are all these cubic cells, and you have to create to stay there, and you have to move every 3 months. And it seems like it's going the same road as sort of Stalinist Russia and the way that it treated its citizens with the same goals in the beginning.
I would say two things about that. The first is that each one of these buildings that I showed is a separate project with a separate model and idea. The overall overarching nature between them is the idea of using financial models and political models as a way to experiment with new types of form. But each one, that's why it's a series, they're not all identical. And it's only Empire Hotel which proposes all of those many ones. And in that sense, what it is really arguing for is plurality, that you cannot produce one product which is homogeneous to fit a homogeneous society. You must have many types of housing for many different types of occupations. One of the things that the British Pavilion did was it was the first exhibition ever to be curated through time spent in the home. And what it said was, it doesn't matter whether you live in the countryside or the city or whether you're rich or poor, we're only going to consider what it means to be at home for hours or months and how that is different from what it means to be at home for decades. It only considered it through a temporal lens, and most of these projects also are very much kind of products of a temporal occupation. So I wouldn't imagine that someone who is a creative, you may choose to live in those buildings forever, but more likely you would probably only want to live in them maybe in your late teens through to your mid-30s. I think it would be very hard to have children in those spaces. But you may also choose that is a life that you want, and that's a freedom which is available to you by providing many different types of housing. So in that sense, nothing I propose is absolutist or universal in that sense. I'm trying to find many different ways to solve the same problems for different types of people. And the idea that everyone lived in something that looked like this would be like, this is why I was saying before that it's an architecture of opposition and resistance. It's not a uniform systemic proposal, because you couldn't build 10 of these next to each other. You can only build one as a political opposition to that space. So I'm still working in a way, I'm trying to find a way to build something which is more universal and less oppositional and more, in a sense, generic. So there's that. No, actually, I think that's both parts of I think that was my response, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
It's actually a bit of a silly question that has to do with I didn't get so much why the broom cupboard and bathrooms had to be transparent.
So what this project tried to do was do two things. One was it was trying to make the what you might call kind of semiotics of the home visible. So there are power relations embedded in everything we own and everything we do. You can tell by how I'm dressed and the fact I have my hair cut this way and that I'm wearing Reeboks and not Nikes. You can immediately begin to tell things about me, right? But we tend to normalize those types of conditions. Also, internal furnishings. There are kind of cultural legacies that we just inherit and replicate and duplicate without really critically thinking about whether or not this is truly the type of existence we want to have. This is the material reality we want. So my suggestion was maybe if we put everything together, it would allow us suddenly to be like better able to judge ourselves and understand ourselves through the objects that we have. So that was part of it. The other part of it was, and then also to create a reduced hierarchy between them, because, for example, I hate putting flowers in a vase in the middle of a table. It creates such a strong hierarchy that seems to me somehow so patriarchal. As soon as you move the vase to one side, it destroys the whole thing. And that relationship of objects to me is very important. So in this, you'll see there's nothing outside, basically, except some books and some headphones. All your objects are contained. The other aspect which actually relates to this, which is, I mentioned that in the plan, there's this room over here, which is a kind of common room that's shared, that's crafted or cut out from the other spaces that you save through this process of kind of destroying function. And that room is this one. And what it also proposes is that this then becomes a kind of repository for objects that we might be prepared to share. So this becomes almost like a display cabinet for the objects that we own in common as a household. And of course, when you think about occupation through time, not every house needs not every apartment needs a vacuum cleaner. It would be ecologically and in other ways superior if we just shared one and owned it like an Uber, had it progressively through time and managed it through time. And then the question was, well, how much or what objects would we be prepared to share, really? And how would we present them? And so we worked with would we share, for example, socks and a t-shirt with our neighbor, or would we share power tools or a pushchair for our kid? And there were some which people seemed very pro, and there were others which people felt more reserved about. So we worked with a British designer called J.W. Anderson to produce a collection of clothes which were gender neutral and age neutral, so that they could be worn by anyone. And this, in effect, becomes the kind of my proposal for what the sharing economy might really be, which is a kind of common wardrobe. And that act of putting it in a vitrine is simply a way of kind of monumentalizing that quality. The bathroom? Why is it in glass? That's basically because the bathroom and the kitchen are the hardest functional spaces to destroy. The bathroom is completely a kind of product of pretty much post-World War I hygiene. I mean, after World War I, people were quite traumatized, and that's when you begin to see the rise in like everyone wanting things that are white and kind of hospital-like. There's a real kind of obsession with sanitation that during the 19th century is kind of more about like public hygiene, and then personal hygiene really takes off in a big way after World War I. And the bathroom becomes then the most perfect expression of bodily functions and function. And in a way, it's like, how do you then destroy that? Well, the first thing is to destroy its form. So you'll see that none of these are really the same shape except the top two ones. They each are a kind of non-functional expression of the activities that they contain. And then, of course, as an element in the plan, it mainly acts as a room divider and as a way to channel the activity or movement of people within the plan, rather than actually serving as a kind of functional room. You'll see here you've got this kind of bathroom that's sort of off the side, right? It's a highly functional space. If that was like a glass sculpture in the middle of the space, or on the stage, it changes very radically your relationship with those activities. Of course, it's also transparent because it's glass. So during the day, it's kind of fine, but what sort of power relations does that create for a couple in the evening? I mean, I don't know, when it's lit from the inside and the room is dark. It challenges, I think, also our relationship with our own bodies and the way in which we conceal or reveal that functional behavior and acknowledge it as a human act rather than put it away as a scientific process. So that's maybe that. I hope that's. I feel I've been pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I think with that comprehensivity, we should all thank you.
Thank you very much.